A quick introduction to Sam. Sam Liebert is All Voting is Local's Wisconsin State Director. Before joining All Voting, Sam was the clerk treasurer for the Village of Shorewood Hills, Wisconsin. Sam has also served in similar capacities for the Village of Sussex and the City of Monroe, both here in Wisconsin. Sam previously served 3 terms on his hometown city council of Janesville, Wisconsin, as an at-large member, representing 64,000 of his fellow residents. He was elected in 2011 and left office in 2017 as city council president. Sam, you must have done that when you were like 18 years old or something, because you certainly seem so young. Before that, Sam worked for several elected officials in their campaigns across the country: President Barack Obama, Senator Russ Feingold, Senator Sherrod Brown, Iowa Governor Tim Vilsack, and Milwaukee Mayor Tom Barrett, to name just a few. Sam holds a Bachelor of Science in Public Policy and Administration from the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, and graduated with a Master's in Public Administration from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in May of 2023. He's also a graduate of the University of Wisconsin's Green Bay Municipal Clerks and Treasurers Institute. And above all, Sam is just such a fabulous leader to all of us in the Wisconsin Voting Rights Coalition. And I am blessed to call him partner and friend. Sam, thanks so much for taking time out of your extremely busy schedule to present to our members here of WIVEC.
Absolutely. And thank you for inviting me, Rhonda and Bonnie. Your friendship and partnership also is just, it means so much to me, to our organization, to have a partner in WIVEC and the work that we do in Wisconsin. It's, as everyone knows, I feel like, as goes Ohio, goes the country, and now it's as goes Wisconsin, goes the country. So we're living in such very crucial, pivotal times, and this is the state to be in. So I'm glad that I'm here on the front lines and working with folks like you. So thanks again for having me, everyone. Again, Sam Liebert, State Director with All Voting is Local. Just a quick little bit more about All Voting. We are also a 501c3 nonpartisan nonprofit. So everything I'll be talking tonight will be nonpartisan in nature, but of course there are also very factual things happening. And so if they happen to be from elected officials or policymakers of either party, we can talk about them and say them by name, but we don't take sides on either any of the political parties or candidates. So, but just a little bit about All Voting. We are dedicated to combating voter suppression and promoting pro-voter policies, particularly those in historically marginalized communities like Black, Brown, Native American, and other communities. We really work tirelessly to expose and dismantle threats to voter freedom, advocating for fair and inclusive rules on voter registration and removing barriers that hinder voting access. Our efforts at All Voting is Local spans 8 states. So we're in Wisconsin, we're in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. So in those states, we engage with local election officials. So in Wisconsin here, clerks, and we work with them to expand voting access. In 2022, in the midterm elections, we helped expand access to 635,000 voters in the 2022 midterm election nationally. And so moving into 2024, we continue with a focus on year-round engagement, education, and advocacy, and really strive to ensure that every voice is heard and that every vote counts in our democracy. And so I guess in response to what we all just watched, and I watched this already a couple times, it can sort of leave you feeling a little down, right? A little, oh, I want to throw my hands up and walk away from it all. But that is exactly what the folks who promote and enable and pass policies and laws that suppress the vote want us to do. They want us to walk away. They want us to disengage. And we need to do the exact opposite. When it comes to voter intimidation of both voters and election officials, there's sort of 4 key things that I and All Voting is Local, and I think a lot of the folks in our Voting Rights Coalition believe in. So the right to vote is fundamental. It is sacred. Every eligible voter should be able to exercise that right without fear of intimidation. Number two, that we entrust election officials to uphold our democratic system, and that they should be able to trust that they can do safely without fear of threats or violence to do their job. And we saw a bit of that in the documentary with election workers who were faced with threats and death threats and intimidation. Um, Number three, voter intimidation is a crime. It's unlawful, even to try to prevent an eligible voter from casting their ballot. It is disconcerting to witness voters from marginalized communities still striving to overcome these barriers to participate in their constitutional right to participate in this in any election. And number four, voter intimidation is not new, especially if you are a person of color, especially if you are a young person, especially if you are a first generation American. There are so many other things that we use to define ourselves where maybe the majority would label us as other. And so it's a self-serving attempt to change who is able to vote and scare off people who are eligible to vote. And so with that, I just want to go into sort of four um, larger items around voter suppression, drop boxes, talking about long lines at polling places, two recent amendments that passed in Wisconsin this past April that were on the ballot, and then a little bit about intimidation of voters and poll workers. So starting with drop boxes, um, they emerged as critical tools, especially during the 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic, which they allowed voters to safely and conveniently return their ballots without relying on potentially overwhelming the post office. Whether you love the post office or not, there have been known to be issues, and so by allowing for drop boxes, it gives really the power to the voter to return it in person, but without having to have human-to-human contact, right? And we were still learning so much about COVID-19 at the time that it was a safe way to do so. So in Wisconsin, drop boxes became particularly important, obviously, like I said, during the pandemic, and they provided voters with a secure alternative to in-person voting and returning those mail-in ballots. Obviously, as we saw in the video, and as most of the people on this call probably know, there was a challenge to drop boxes, and they were eventually found unconstitutional in Wisconsin. And so right now, there's actually a new case for drop boxes in Wisconsin, and oral arguments begin actually on May 13th. And so a week from Monday, opening oral arguments will begin. A lot of politicos and sort of political insiders believe that drop boxes will come back in some form or fashion. As many of you know, we had a pretty consequential Supreme Court race last April. God, that was already a year ago. And so there's a new makeup of the court. And so it's their prerogative that they want to revisit this. And so how drop boxes will look is sort of up in the air, but many people believe that they will come back in some form or fashion. And so obviously putting restrictions on drop boxes, there's a lot of issues, right? Limiting the number that you can have, maybe in a per city or a county. They can also disproportionately impact marginalized communities. So for example, rural areas or neighborhoods with limited transportation options, may rely more heavily on drop boxes. And maybe having more of them as options would help folks there. In some states, there have actually been efforts, like there were in Wisconsin, to ban and restrict drop boxes, often justified under the guise of, and I'll use air quotes, election security. However, many studies have been shown that drop boxes are actually a very secure way to vote, to cast your ballot, and with rigorous protocols in place, there you can prevent tampering. I, as a former municipal clerk in a lot of the communities I worked in, I was also the treasurer, and so I also collected property tax bills. We collected all sorts of payments through the Dropbox, and so I always found it interesting that people were, they're willing to put a three, four, $5,000 tax bill check, sometimes even an envelope full of cash in the Dropbox. But when it came to the ballots, apparently that was a line too far. And so, people are comfortable with returning many other things to drop boxes, and ballots are just as secure. And then also, I would say that, any proposals to restrict Dropbox access should be carefully evaluated for their potential impact on voter turnout, especially among communities already facing barriers to voting. Um, and so, there's some states that, they do have drop boxes. I was actually just in Texas a month or so ago for an election conference, and they still have drop boxes in Texas, but it's something like they can only have like one per county. And so whether you're a county with 15 or 20,000 voters, or you're a county where it's Houston and you've got, 1.5 million people, obviously there's a disproportionate um, uh, execution and implementation of drop boxes there. So um, obviously, drop boxes help more people vote. I'm of the belief, and my organization is, the more people that vote, the better, right? When we all do well, we all do well. Moving on to long lines at polling places. Um, Long lines of polling places obviously can deter voters from participating in the electoral process, especially if they have time constraints, work, childcare, other responsibilities. Again, we saw a lot of that in the film, where people were like, hey, like, I got to get back home and take like my medicine. I've been out here for 3, 4, 5 hours. I got to go. And then they showed sort of the disproportionate response, and it appeared to be maybe a more affluent, or like a white rural or suburban voting location, where they're like, well, yeah, we have no problems voting. We're in and out, and we've got all the voting machines we need, and it goes quickly. In Wisconsin, though, actually, long lines have been a persistent issue, especially in certain wards. Um, Predominantly in Milwaukee and some of our larger urban settings. And so there's been a lot of calls for improved infrastructure and resources to support shortening of lines. In 2020, for example, the election saw long lines in Milwaukee, where polling places were consolidated due to shortages of poll workers and COVID-related challenges. So in 2020, Milwaukee went from like 120, 130 polling locations to 4. And so obviously that is a huge drastic change, right? You've literally changed up the game. It was obviously due to the ongoing health issue concerns at the time and whatnot. But the city had to adapt. I will give kudos to the Milwaukee Elections Commission and their director, that they and a lot of voting rights groups did a great job educating the public where they had to go, where the new polling locations were, but also, again, encouraging people to vote early, vote by mail, voting at in-person absentee voting locations. Milwaukee has 3 of them. One of them that's very famous was the Midtown location, right there at 60th and Capitol in Milwaukee, if you're familiar. And actually, that Midtown location is the largest in-person early voting site in the Midwest. So even it gets more early in-person votes than any other early voting location, beating out places like Chicago and Detroit. So it's quite impressive, the number of votes that they get through there. Um, Some remedies to this, obviously, is investments in additional polling places, additional voting machines, increasing staff training will help reduce wait times to ensure that all voters have equal access to the ballot box. This obviously includes things like measures such as early voting opportunities, expanding polling hours, and improving voter education to encourage voters to plan ahead and to avoid peak times. So again, Milwaukee and Madison and other communities are doing this. We'll talk a little bit about it next, but one of the amendments that passed in Wisconsin this past election actually outlawed private funds of money to be given to municipalities for election administration. You may have heard the term Zuckerbucks as sort of a derogatory sort of term, but so both Madison and Milwaukee, before that that amendment passed, that banned that, they both had about $1 million or $1 million+ in funds from these groups, and they did these types of things. They bought more voting machines. I think Madison actually bought some special counting machine, so it can count early mail-in ballots much faster, so that they can get faster results on election night. Because in Wisconsin, we can't actually open our ballots that were mailed in or cast early until election day. And in many states, they can start tabulating them or pre-processing a day or earlier before election day. But Wisconsin, we can't open up a single ballot until 7 a.m. on election day. So it was great to see Madison and Milwaukee take those initiatives. Then, of course, addressing long lines of polling locations is not just a matter of convenience, but it's also a crucial step in safeguarding our democracy and protecting our rights. And so shorter lines, getting in and out faster, it only increases people's perceptions and reality that voting is easy, it's something simple to do, and it's not a burden and something that you should have to wait several hours to do, because it's a fundamental right that we are all guaranteed. So transitioning quickly to the amendments that were recently voted on in Wisconsin, there were two constitutional amendments that were on our ballots, question 1 and question 2. Question 1 asked if to allow for the prohibition of non-governmental funding of election administration. So that passed with just a little over 54% of the vote. And question 2 asked, should only designated election officials be able to conduct elections? And that seems like a pretty straightforward question. And that passed with almost 59% of the vote, so about 5 percentage points higher than the other amendments. On the face of most things, right, these both sound like very good things, right? When you talk to people about having money in politics or money in elections, overwhelmingly people support, not having dark money or PACs or untraceable money flooding our election system. And so this question, I think, is a bit of a Trojan horse. I think, it talks about election administration, election officials, and there's actually been some studies done where when you start talking about election officials, it actually takes a while when you're talking with focus groups, because people get confused between election officials and elected officials, right? Politicians, legislators, folks like that. And so the way these are worded were very purposely worded these ways, these specific ways, to appear good on the outside. But actually, in actuality, especially in Wisconsin, our election administrators, our municipal clerks, are overworked and underfunded. In Wisconsin, we have a very segregated election system. As many of you probably know, if you've been poll workers or observers in the past, every city, town, and village runs their own election. And so we have 1,850, maybe 853 municipalities in Wisconsin. And so there's 1,853 separate elections that are being administered. They may be all for statewide elections, right? And then we aggregate all the votes, especially if it's an at-wide or presidential election. But you've got 1,850 different people running elections. And so they are funded at the local level. They don't really get any money from the states. You could pretty much almost count the feds out for helping out. And if anyone knows anything about local government, for over the past decade, maybe decade and a half now, essentially local government tax levies have been frozen. And the only way that they can increase their funding is through a thing called net new construction. And so unless you're one of these really large cities or villages, maybe a town that's having a huge boom where you're building a lot of houses or a lot of businesses are coming in, you're not seeing the fruits of the housing boom. You're not seeing the fruits of the building boom, which adds to your net new value of your community and increases how much you can bring in for taxes. And so essentially most of the state has been left behind. Recently, there were some bills that increased shared revenues from the states, and but when it comes to prioritizing, as a former city council member, I will say, as much as I love Parks and Rec, and as much as I love all of the folks that I think do the good things that make a community vibrant and why people want to live there and move there. The things that really always get priority are police, fire, and public works, our roads, our infrastructure, our public safety folks. And so not much is usually left over, or there's an oversight that any of that would trickle down to the clerk's office or election administrators. And so by passing this constitutional amendment, essentially any sort of third-party funding for election administration is off the table. And so all voting is local. We argue now that this is passed, let's have the conversation of fully funding our elections. Let's support our clerks. Obviously, people don't become poll workers for the money, but let's at least pay our poll workers a living wage. If it's whether it's $15 an hour or whatever. Many communities are having issues recruiting poll workers. And so let's fund that. Our state is sitting on a $7 billion surplus. And unfortunately, the legislature and the governor can't agree on how to use some of those funds. But we're hoping that in the future, maybe a future legislature, that there might be more pro-democratic, lowercase d legislators that are willing to fund our elections. And the other question that was asked, question two, was, should only officially designated election officials be able to conduct elections? This is again another Trojan horse amendment, in our opinion. The fact that it's already essentially state statute, state law, that only folks who can work on elections can run elections. We argue that this is going to essentially just increase more bureaucracy, more paperwork. It has a chilling effect, and that's also a big part of these two amendments, is it has a chilling effect on our clerks, that they're not going to want to be as above and beyond in their jobs if they're able to. And so again, this is another one of those issues. And I was using as an example, in 2020, when I was a clerk for the presidential election, and all of a sudden, we've got, I think we had like 7,000 or 8,000 registered voters in our community, and about half of them, 3,500 to 4,000, requested mail ballots. And the turnaround time statutorily between when the county clerk has to deliver the ballots to us local municipal clerks and when the ballots have to get out the door in the mail, it's like 2 or 3 days. And so normally when we only had 100 or 200 permanently or indefinitely confined voters, or a few of the, my kids, we're going to be in Europe that week, whatever, 200 ballots, that was nothing. I had a small staff of, 2 full-time staff and then 3 part-time staff. But all of a sudden, within 3 days, I had to get out 4,000 ballots. And so at the time, I also oversaw my park and rec department in our village. And so I brought in my park and rec director, I brought in my foreman, I brought in my park techs, I brought in my, village hall cleaning crew, and we formed a huge assembly line. And we obviously the things that required me to do, whether it was initialing certificates or ballots and printing out labels, like I did all that, but I needed a small army to get all these ballots out. And I didn't deputize my park and rec crew, but I was there overseeing them, I was managing them. So now under this, I'm gonna have to go, so a clerk would probably have to go through the process maybe of, deputizing every single person that's touching any part of the process. Also, something that's not really well known is 2/3, so of the 1,850, 2/3 of those clerks around the state are part-time clerks. And so they're either retired, or this is like their side hustle, and they work a 9 to 5 somewhere else, and then, oh, by the way, they're also their town clerk. So what happens when they get home and they're gonna try to get out 20 ballots in the mail, that they log into the computer, okay, I'm running these, and then their little 10-year-old daughter Sally wants to lick the envelopes. Like, is she breaking the law because her daughter touched those ballots? Right, it's really silly. Again, it was another Trojan horse type amendment to just cause a chilling effect and just bring into question again the integrity of our voting system in Wisconsin. And I will say that I'm hoping that there will be some sort of legal action around this question, because it's essentially already in law. And so have heard, possibly that some groups might be challenging this. The Dane County Council in Madison is asking the Attorney General for an opinion. What is the definition of an election official? Because it's very vague in our state law. And so this is something you might see some news about pretty soon. And then quickly wrapping it up, the last item is just, intimidation of voters and poll workers. And I keep saying poll workers is a generic term in Wisconsin. We call them election inspectors. But intimidation of voters and poll workers really represents one of the greatest threats to the integrity of our electoral process. And it really undermines the fundamental principles of our democracy. Instances of voter intimidation, such as aggressive questioning or the presence of armed individuals near polling places, can create a hostile environment that suppresses voter turnout. A lot of people talk about political violence as being something that is happening or going to happen this year. And I will say, if you hear the term political violence, it doesn't have to be physical, right? It doesn't have to be, an active shooter situation. It doesn't have to be someone physically assaulting someone. It can just be the presence of intimidation, causing fear to someone so that they would act or change the way their behavior is. And so voter intimidation is also political violence. Also, I will say in Wisconsin and across the country, concerns about voter intimidation have been raised in the context of recent elections, particularly in hotly contested areas with a history of voter suppression. Efforts to intimidate voters include misinformation campaigns, targeted harassment, things that undermine the public trust in the electoral process and erode confidence in democracy. So protecting the safety and security of voters and poll workers is essential to upholding our democratic principles of free and fair elections that we all grew up on and still believe in. This includes implementing measures to prevent and respond to instances of intimidation, such as training poll workers to recognize signs of harassment, de-escalation training, coordinating with law enforcement to ensure a swift and appropriate response. So these are all things that are going on. Even here in Wisconsin, there was a bill that was introduced that would have created a new category of harassment and assault that would have been an increase in protection for clerks and poll workers. You'll see a theme here. Unfortunately, it did not pass. I think due to partisan for partisan reasons. But fortunately, on the other side of the coin, this is something All Voting is Local is working on, is at the municipal level, towns, villages, and cities can pass ordinances to increase penalties or fines or fees against those that would harass, intimidate, or assault poll workers or clerks. And so we're really happy that cities like Madison, Sheboygan, Racine, Glendale, Stevens Point, have passed these, and we're working with other communities right now like Green Bay and Milton, Beloit, to pass similar ordinances. So we, even if the legislature is not taking threats to poll workers and to voters seriously, there are city councils, village boards, and town boards that are. So it's reassuring, and it fills my cup back up at the end of the day. And also, just additionally, efforts to combat voter intimidation must involve proactive measures to educate the public about their rights, and empower individuals to report instances of harassment and intimidation. So, it's one of those sort of old adages, right? If you see something, say something. State statute gives a lot of power to our election inspectors, especially the chief inspectors. So every polling location has a chief inspector. A lot of people think that the clerk really runs the elections. But as a former clerk, I'll say clerks, what we do is we do all the preparation. And then for 13 hours, our chief inspectors really run the election. And then we come back on the back end to help them process, organize, and close out the polling places for the day. So in state statute, chief inspectors at every polling location are given a lot of authority to remove people from a polling location if they're being a disturbance, if they're causing a nuisance. Unfortunately, this past election, we did see at UW Green Bay some students were being harassed by some poll observers, and the chief inspector tried to remove them, and she called the police. It's a university, so the university police responded, and the police didn't kick them out because they said they weren't causing a problem, they weren't a nuisance. And unfortunately, those police officers didn't know the power that chief inspectors have. And so one of the small programs that we're doing on the side at All Voting is Local, in conjunction with a lot of our partners in the Voting Rights Coalition, is planning to write letters to every university police department and spelling out for them in nice terms. And you know, we don't want to be pushy, but just saying, hey, just want to let you know, if you have polling locations on your campuses, chief inspectors have authority to remove folks, and we hope and expect that the police will cooperate and work with them. And so it's little things like that that really make a difference in combating voter suppression. So again, by promoting awareness and accountability, communities can come together to safeguard the integrity of the electoral process and protect the right to vote for all citizens. And so with that, hopefully some of it was optimistic that there are things in motion to combat. And there's a lot of other things I didn't touch on, right? I didn't touch on voter ID. I didn't touch on voter registration. I didn't touch on purging of rolls. You know, there is a multifaceted approach to voter suppression in the country, and especially in America. It's very real. You know, it's probably more on the C4 side, so I won't say it, but if you just Google Wisconsin and voter suppression in the Google News tab, you will see some pretty recent things that have also taken off. And it's very real. It's very much alive. It's scary, you know, what we do know. But as one of my fellow executive directors from Black Leaders Organizing Communities, you know, she said, I don't know what's scarier, what we know or what we don't know. And so it's just all the more reason to be vigilant, to be a part of the process, and you know, just to become a poll worker, become a poll observer, you know, get your family and friends involved in the process, because that's what it's going to take at the end of the day to make sure that everyone who wants to vote is able to cast a ballot. And with that, I'm open to a conversation or questions. And again, thank you to Rhonda and Rabbi Bonnie for having me today.
Thank you, Sam. That was fabulous. And going from the national lookup from the movie to what's happening in our own state and our own neighborhoods. So thank you so much. We did say if there's anyone who has a question to put it in the chat. If anyone would like to do that, please feel free, or you're welcome to raise your virtual hand and ask your question out loud. Give you a few minutes.
I'm going to exercise my privilege to ask a question out loud. Thank you, Sam. That was really amazing, a fabulous rundown of very complicated issues. And I totally appreciate you could not possibly hit all of them in one brief presentation, which is kind of scary how much there is out there that you can't cover it all. The original Dropbox case was called Tegan. Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice, the League of Women Voters, and the Disability Rights Coalition were parties to that case. And our three organizations are right now in the process of submitting an amicus brief for the next case that's coming on Dropboxes. So this is something that's very near and dear to our hearts. But Sam, I had a question for you. When these two referenda passed, which are now in our state constitution, the second one about only designated election officials can work the elections. Rhonda and I are both poll workers. I've been a poll worker since 2018, and Rhonda did it for the first time this year and was very excited to do it. And we looked at each other after the election and said, we can't be poll workers anymore because we're not designated official Wisconsin election officials. Is that true?
I am not a lawyer. I will start by saying that. I'm a local government nerd, so I got my degrees and all that. But I will say that yes, there's a lot of confusion around this question. So one of the things that All Voting is Locals does, we started this year, is we're traveling the state and we're talking with clerks. We're holding this clerk town hall series where we're meeting with clerks in small intimate groups and just really listening. You know, what's going on? How do you feel about your safety? How do you feel about poll worker recruitment? And then inevitably question 2 comes up. And there's also apparently some weird language. So clerks can become clerks in a couple ways. They can be appointed, which is pretty common. So it's kind of like any other job. You apply based on your credentials, education. I've always been an appointed clerk, and you're hired by your city council or town or village board. But in a lot of our smaller communities, most townships and and some villages, your local clerk is also an elected official. They put their name on a ballot, and whoever gets the most votes for clerk is the clerk in that community. And many times, they run unopposed. It's a thankless job. No one wants to do it. So actually, you're seeing some communities switching away from elected clerks to appointed because they can't find anyone that lives in the community that wants to be a clerk. And so apparently there's some sort of weird language with question 2 and appointed clerks because there's something to do with like they weren't elected, they were appointed. And so there's also some appointed clerks now saying, am I not an election official? Because state statute says that your clerk is elected. And this, Constitution was written 1840s, right? We keep hearing a lot about state constitutions around the country. 1840s seem to be sort of the sweet spot for weird or ambiguous legislation. And so, yeah, there's questions there. And I will also just put out there too that, clerks are, it's such a thankless job sometimes because clerks don't also just run elections. They, in many of these small townships, the clerk sort of is the government. They are the administrator. They are the HR director. They are the public works director. They have to take all the minutes for all the meetings. They have to file all sorts of reports with the state and federal government. So I'd say, election stuff, sometimes it's only 10-20% of their job throughout the year. They're issuing dog and cat licenses, right? They take all the calls to the town or village hall. And so, they're overworked. And actually in some communities, some smaller communities, there are sometimes there'll be like 2 or 3 townships, and what they'll do is hire the same person to be the clerk for 2 or 3 different communities and sort of bundle their resources, so that he or she can have a full-time job, because maybe it doesn't equate to be a full-time job in a community of 200 people, but 2 or 3 communities can sort of chip in together and have one person run. It's such an underappreciated career choice, and it's definitely something that we'd love to see more at All Voting is Local, is a more support and more professionalization of the career and more respect. I mean, they just do so much that most people don't know about. But thanks for that question about question 2.
And Sam, thanks. There's a question in the chat about the efforts put into the referendums, and that if I guess the question is asking, did we put in enough effort? And in the future, I always ask this, in the future, what more can we do? And I know that's been some chat. There's been a lot of chatter in our voting rights coalitions about how to bring in correct messaging and positive messaging regarding these amendments.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll speak to that briefly. So within the Voting Rights Coalition groups, there were some groups who put some money into a vote no campaign on both of the questions. There was some confusion around state law, whether or not the groups had to form together to create like an election committee with the ethics commission at the state level, limiting, how much money could be spent, or, people's salary and time and benefits being put towards these. But there were a lot of groups that did different things. We did a lot of press. There were folks who did phone calls, as Karen mentioned. There were also a lot of text messaging, and there was some, I think, direct mail and different things. But at the end of the day, unfortunately, it wasn't enough. I think the different groups that did the Vote No campaign learned a lot from the April election, and there are more ballot initiatives coming up this August. There's 2, again, in my opinion, very bad referendum questions. And then in November, there's a one that's really related to voting rights, where it states that you have to be a U.S. citizen to vote in any election in Wisconsin. And so it's already federal law that you have to be a U.S. citizen to vote in federal elections, so right, the president, Congress, U.S. Senate. But there are some states, and currently under Wisconsin law, if a local community wanted to pass an ordinance saying that non-U.S. citizens could vote in school board races or city council races or county board races, they could. And so this is sort of preempting local communities from doing that. And even in some states too, they're allowing 16 and 17-year-olds to vote in local elections. So again, not federal big ticket elections, but local elections. And, you know, I think there's different philosophies behind it, but I think ultimately at the end of the day, if you live in a community, whether you're a US citizen or not, you do pay taxes, you're part of the community, your kids go to school there. Should I be allowed to vote for my school board members, you know? And so that question in November is also, again, it's worded really flowery and it looks nice. And there'll have to be a lot that needs to be done to stop that one as well.
Thanks, Sam. Ernestine, you always have such great questions in our webinars. Thank you. Ernestine, you're welcome to ask your question.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for recognizing me. I want to thank you for giving us the update on the Dropbox, because I was hoping somebody was going to be challenging that, and so it's on the way. That's a good thing. But I'm also interested in whether the procedures that they use to put these amendments on the ballot, were they followed? I thought amendments to the Constitution took 2 cycles or something like that. And did they meet that? And how did we miss it?
Yeah, no, good question. So, yeah, in order to get a question on the ballot to amend the Constitution, a resolution has to pass both houses of the legislature, so the Assembly and the Senate. It has to be identical, word for word. It has to pass 2 legislative sessions. And so I think a legislative session is essentially sort of like a January through, you know, I think they through the fall, and then they have times off in between. But so they did it in 2020, so 2022 or 2023, and then in the next session they passed it again for these. And so yeah, it did seem sort of under a radar type thing. Again, there were some groups tracking it, and unfortunately it's sort of it's both a good and a bad tool, right? So obviously you have a very, you know, and again, just talking factually, we have a very gerrymandered Republican supermajority legislature and a Democratic governor, and they don't get along on a lot. And so in order to pass bills or things that they think are good policy, this legislature has really used our Constitution as a back door to passing laws as opposed to through the normal process. But I will say on the other end, for people who support, so as an issue, I'll say having a non or bipartisan redistricting process for how we draw maps going forward. Maybe, you know, with a future legislature, because we have new maps now that are in effect for August and November, perhaps a future legislature will put to the question, a constitutional referendum question, you know, should we have a nonpartisan, bipartisan process, and spell it out in that question. And then that gets enshrined in our Constitution, because, you know, it's one thing to pass a law and say, yep, we're going to do nonpartisan redistricting every 10 years. But if you have a majority of a party that doesn't like that, they can just get rid of the bill. Whereas if it's enshrined in the Constitution, I think it essentially takes, another constitutional amendment to remove it. So, you know, you see a lot of states doing this through constitutional amendments for redistricting, abortion rights, healthcare rights, legalizing marijuana, expanding Medicaid expansion. Wisconsin, I think, is one of the last few states who hasn't done that, taking the federal dollars. And so there's also sort of an upside to this, but unfortunately in the past dozen years or so, we've sort of seen it used to suppress the will of the people and sort of trick us into voting for amendments that sound nice, but they really have sort of ill intent behind them.
A follow-up to that, did they have the hearings that we, should have, the public, to get public input, at least to educate us on what they were proposing?
Yeah, as far as I know, yeah, Ernestine, they did. I mean, again, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not 100% sure, but based on what I've talked with other groups like Law Forward and other legal groups, they did do this legally. It's really weird at the state level. There's not as high of a bar for public comment or public hearings as you would see maybe at like a school board or city council, where, I feel like our local government is held to a much higher standard of transparency and informing the public of what they're doing. With the state legislature, a lot of times they shut down public comment or they make it a very small window. It's on the 33rd day of the 13th month, you can submit public comment, right? I'm being facetious, of course, but they really have done a lot to shut down public comment, or even when they have public comment, again, because of the gerrymandered districts that we've had, they haven't been accountable to the people. They've only been accountable to special interests and their own reelection.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the good question.
Looking to see if there's any other questions. I know, Vernetta, thank you for your comments in the chat. Well, Sam, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Like I said earlier, I consider myself so fortunate, and WIVEC so fortunate, to have partnership with someone like you, and with All Voting is Local. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry that all the members of our webinar tonight didn't get to see your incredible office background, which is always so much fun for me to see in our meetings, but you did blur it. So again, Sam, thanks so much. I know that this was a bit more difficult for you because you were a bit under the weather, so thank you. And of course, thank you to everyone here. We always like to end on a positive note and what our calls of action can be. And it's just so important to know that while there are multifaceted ways that there are bad actors who are looking to suppress our vote, there's also multifaceted approaches to combating this voter suppression, and All Voting is Local is such a leader in that. So thank you for all the work you do for us here in Wisconsin. As for WIVEC here, what can we do? We're the little engine that could, I like to say. We power through congregations, and first, many of you are probably members of our newsletter, but if not, or if you know of people who should become members of WIVEC and receive our newsletter, as many of you have noticed, it is new and improved. It's a little more user-friendly. I appreciate it. So please, everyone, if anyone that you know would like to join our group, please have them email me. If you are not a member of WIVEC, please email me. You get a newsletter once a week, typically on Tuesdays, and it's chock full of all sorts of information. Our next webinar is actually in 5 or 6 days. It's on Tuesday, which is more of a call to action. It is calls to actions for congregations. Some of you are signed up for it and others are not. Please consider joining this and sharing it with your congregations. Vernetta, I see that you had a whole group on your screen, so thank you so much for bringing some networks to you as well. Also, again, a call to action, like Sam said, is to become a poll worker. Rabbi Bonnie said she's done it for many years. I did it for the first time, thoroughly enjoyed my time. I live in up in the town of Grafton, so I was a poll worker in the town of Grafton. Please, everyone, consider becoming a poll worker. If you have children or grandchildren, they can work as poll workers as young as 16. If you have any questions, please let me know. Power the Polls is a great website that leads you directly to your local clerk. Also, in terms of voter protection, WIVEC is again leading the charge in our Pope Chaplain program. Please recruit your clergy leaders to participate in our Pole Chaplain program. It will be on Election Day in November. We started in 2020, increased to 25 clergy members across the state in Wisconsin. And thanks to All Voting is Local and your support, we're looking to add another 25 and have a poll chaplain and have 50 poll chaplains across the state to protect those people in line, especially if those lines get long. And if there are some people who are looking to cause some problems, our poll chaplains will be trained to help that situation. Next, we have just so much going on here. Coming to a congregation near you is our Pray With Your Feet, Pray With Your Vote 2024 launch on June 20th. We will have more information available to you, hopefully within the next 2 weeks. Everyone, please mark that down. We will be meeting across the state in multiple locations. So please, everyone, keep that evening free. You won't want to miss a really lovely statewide event. And this movie is available for anyone who'd like to show it in your congregation. You can email me. My email was given. I'll put it in the chat one more time. You are welcome to email me, and I will provide information for you to share it with any of your congregations or your networks. And of course, we stay running through donations, through grants from organizations, but also through donations, big or small, from members like all of you. So please, everyone, if you'd like to help promote voter engagement, voter education, and voter protection, many of you know what WIVEC does, and we are grassroots advocacy, grassroots engagement, and grassroots education program. And I just had a brainstorm for our next webinar, Rabbi Bonnie, so be on the lookout for an email from me. And please, everyone, if it's something that you're willing to do, please consider making a donation to WIVEC. I think, Sierra, that you had the link, I believe. Thank you so much. And thank you again. I know that there's a lot of things we could be doing tonight, watching our favorite Netflix show, or being outside if it's not raining. So thanks so much for being here tonight. I really appreciate it. And I love seeing all the names of our partners and the people who I work with. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Thank you to Sam for his wonderful presentation, Rhonda for organizing this, Sierra always for your tech help, without which we could not do this. Thank you all, your wonderful partners, and we will see you hopefully on the 7th.